A group of 5 friends, Ethan, Jessica, Ryan, Olivia, and Jake, decides to go on a camping trip to a remote and eerie lakeside cabin deep in the woods. The place is rumored to be haunted, with strange stories surrounding it. Many years ago, a group of campers mysteriously disappeared here, but the 5 friends, eager for an adventurous weekend, shrug off these rumors, convinced it's all just folklore. Little did they know, the trip would soon turn into a terrifying nightmare. As night falls, they set up their tents by the campfire and settle in. The air grows colder, and a strange chill spreads through the camp. The woods around them seem unnaturally quiet. Despite this, they continue to laugh and share ghost stories, dismissing the sense of unease creeping over them. Around midnight, when everyone has finally decided to go to sleep, an eerie whispering sound breaks the silence. At first, they think it's just the wind rustling through the trees, but as the voices grow louder and more distinct, they begin to feel a sense of dread. Jessica, lying in her tent, whispers to Ethan, "Did you hear that? Someone's calling us." Ethan, still trying to convince himself it's nothing, says, "Probably just some wild animal or maybe another group camping nearby." However, the whispering doesn't stop. It becomes clearer, almost like it's calling their names one by one. The group starts to get nervous. Ryan, who's always been skeptical, says, "This is ridiculous. We're just scaring ourselves. It's probably just an echo from the lake." But as they listen more carefully, the whispers grow louder, as if they're coming from all directions at once. Then suddenly, a low, metallic ringing sound pierces the air, the distinct toll of a bell. Ethan, heart-pounding, asks, "Where is that sound coming from? We're the only ones here, right?" Everyone freezes, straining to hear. The ringing continues for several moments before fading into silence. It feels unnatural, like something from another time. It's not the wind, nor is it some forgotten bell from an old church nearby. It's too precise. The next morning, when the group wakes up, they find that their belongings are missing. Their sleeping bags, water bottles, flashlights, and even their food are all gone. It's as if someone had come in during the night and taken everything. Ryan, in disbelief, says, "We were all in our tents last night. How could everything just vanish?" Ethan, trying to make sense of it, adds, "This is impossible. We didn't leave anything outside." The group starts to search around, but there's no sign of their belongings. Then, in the distance, near the edge of the forest, they spot something odd. A pile of their missing items, along with a withered old blanket and a faded photograph. The photo is strange. It shows 5 people, their faces partially obscured, standing in front of an old wooden cabin. Beneath it, someone had written in faded ink, "We never left." Olivia, unnerved, says, "This doesn't make sense. Who put our things here? And why that photograph?" Jake, his nerves starting to fray, adds, "It's like someone's been watching us the whole time." As the group tries to make sense of the bizarre situation, they discover a hidden cave near the campsite. It looks abandoned, but there's something compelling about it. The entrance is narrow, and the air is cold and heavy. Ethan, always the brave one, suggests they explore it, hoping to find an explanation. As they enter the cave, the temperature drops even further. A deep, unsettling silence surrounds them, broken only by the sound of their footsteps. The walls are lined with strange markings, symbols that seem ancient and alien, though they don't recognize them. Jessica stumbles upon an old tattered scroll stuck to the wall. As she unfurls it, the text seems to shimmer before her eyes, as if the words are shifting. The forgotten ones, those who were lost here, never truly leave. It reads. Olivia looks horrified. This can't be real. This place is cursed. Suddenly, the temperature plunges. A loud, hollow echo rings out, and the whispers return. Only now, they sound much clearer. They're no longer whispers, but full, eerie voices speaking to them directly. Help us, the voices cry. Don't go further. You're not supposed to be here. As the group turns to leave, they notice that the cave walls now feature portraits. But not just any portraits. These are faces they recognize. Their own faces drawn in a way that seems both familiar and wrong. The eyes are hollow, and the expressions are twisted. In their panic, the group rushes out of the cave, but Jake, who had been lagging behind, disappears. They call for him, but there's no answer. Desperate, they search the area, but it's as if he's vanished into thin air. Jake! Ethan shouts, but only the wind responds. They retrace their steps, but there's no sign of him anywhere. The forest feels oppressive, and the shadows seem to move in unnatural ways. Olivia starts to panic. We need to get out of here. We can't just stay here any longer. Ryan tries to calm her down. We'll find Jake, I promise. He's just hiding or... But before he can finish, they hear a strange sound from the woods. A faint cry for help. But it's not Jake's voice. It's a guttural, distorted sound that seems to come from all around them. The ground beneath them shakes, and the once peaceful forest becomes a maze of terror. As the group continues to search for Jake, something even stranger begins to happen. No matter which direction they walk in, they keep finding themselves back at the campsite, as if they're stuck in some kind of loop. It's the same clearing, the same trees, the same terrifying atmosphere. Olivia, now in a state of utter disbelief, says, "This is impossible. We've been walking for hours and we keep coming back here." Ryan shakes his head. It's like we're trapped in time. Like nothing we're doing is real. They realize they can't escape. The forest feels endless, and the strange, ghostly bell rings again, drawing them closer to the same spot each time. It's as though the forest itself is playing tricks on them, manipulating reality. As they walk, they begin to see things from the corner of their eyes. Figures moving just out of sight, shadows that don't belong. Then, one by one, they begin to see their own faces, not in photographs this time, but in the air, floating just above them. Their own reflections, twisted and wrong. In a final desperate attempt to leave, they make their way back to the lake. The boat they had arrived in is still there, but as they approach, they notice something horrifying. The water is unnaturally still, and beneath the surface, they can see their own reflections. All 5 of them. Suddenly the bell rings louder, and their faces vanish beneath the water. Ethan tries to grab the boat, but the surface of the lake distorts, pulling him in. The others try to help, but they too are sucked under. It's as if the lake is claiming them, just as it did with the campers before them. In a final flash of terror, Ethan is submerged and everything goes dark. The camp remains silent, the fire long extinguished. No sign of the 5 friends is left. Just an old weathered photograph near the campfire. The photograph shows 5 faces, but they are not the friends who came to camp. They are the lost souls of those who never left. And the bell rings once more. In a small, quiet American town named Willow Creek, life moved at its usual slow pace. Among the locals, Dave, the friendly neighborhood postman, was a familiar face. Always punctual, always smiling, Dave had been delivering letters in the town for over a decade. His routine never changed, and neither did the town. Until one fateful morning when Dave found a letter that was never supposed to be delivered. That morning, as Dave picked up his mailbag from the post office, he noticed something unusual. Among the regular letters and packages was an old, weathered envelope covered in dust. There was no name, no return address, just a faded destination. Blackwood Manor, house number. On which Dave frowned. Blackwood Manor? The name sent a chill down his spine. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that Blackwood Manor had been abandoned for decades. It was rumored to be cursed. People who wandered too close often claimed they heard whispers or felt cold hands brushing against them. But Dave, practical and rational, laughed off such superstitions. It was just a house after all. Dave set out on his errand, determined to complete his delivery. The letter couldn't stay undelivered forever, and he thought he might as well drop it off and get it over with. As he approached Blackwood Manor, the atmosphere began to change. The once bright and sunny day turned gloomy. The trees lining the path to the manor seemed to close in, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air grew cold, and a strange silence enveloped him. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. Dave felt as though the world was holding its breath. When Dave finally reached the manor, he found it just as he'd heard in stories, dark, crumbling, and suffocatingly eerie. The house loomed over him, its windows like hollow eyes. The door was slightly ajar, creaking gently in the wind. With hesitant steps, Dave walked up to the porch. "Hello? Is anyone here?" he called, his voice echoing in the empty silence. No answer. He decided to leave the letter on the doorstep and turn back. But as he placed the envelope down, the door swung open wider as though inviting him in. Against his better judgment, Dave stepped inside. The interior of the house was worse than he expected. The walls were covered in cobwebs, the furniture draped in sheets, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the air. But what unsettled Dave the most were the faint whispers he began to hear. "Leave. Turn back." But another voice, deeper and more commanding, whispered, "Stay." Dave froze. He turned, but no one was there. Suddenly, the letter in his hand grew warm. When he looked down, the address on it had changed. Now it read, "For the postman." The moment Dave realized the letter was meant for him, the house seemed to come alive. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting into unnatural shapes. One shadow, taller and darker than the rest, detached itself and began creeping towards him. Dave ran to the door, but it slammed shut on its own. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, until they were deafening. He screamed, "What do you want from me?" The tall shadow loomed over him, and in a voice that rattled his very bones, it said, "Deliver the letter." "What letter?" Dave stammered. The shadow pointed to the envelope, now glowing faintly in his trembling hands. "Deliver it to the dead," the voice said. Dave was confused and terrified. "How can I deliver a letter to the dead?" he cried. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, the room changed. The walls dissolved, and Dave found himself standing in what looked like a graveyard. The gravestones were cracked and ancient, but one stood out. It was freshly dug, and on it was inscribed his own name. Panic overtook Dave as he realized the grave was meant for him. The letter in his hand seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The voice echoed again, "Deliver it, or take their place." Suddenly, ghostly figures began to rise from the graves, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They reached out with skeletal hands, their moans filling the air. Dave ran, but the cemetery seemed endless, looping back on itself. He finally stopped in front of a mausoleum. Its doors creaked open, and inside he saw a black altar. Trembling, he placed the letter on the altar. The ground shook, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A man in a tattered postman's uniform. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his grin chilling. "Welcome," the figure said. "You've delivered the letter, but you've also delivered yourself." Dave screamed as he felt his body being pulled apart, his soul torn from him. The ghostly postman laughed, taking his place. "You're free to go. For now," the ghost said, vanishing into the mist. The next morning, a new postman arrived at Willow Creek's post office. Among the letters in his bag was an old, dusty envelope addressed to Blackwood Manor, house number. En route, as the new postman began his route, he didn't notice the shadow of Dave watching him from the crumbling walls of the abandoned mansion, his face frozen in eternal despair. Blackwood Manor was never just a house. It was a trap. The letter wasn't meant to be delivered. It was meant to choose its next victim. And the cursed postman? He was doomed to watch forever as the cycle repeated itself. In a quiet, isolated town, nestled between thick forests and endless hills, there was a legend that chilled the hearts of all who lived there. A legend about a mysterious girl who would appear every full moon. But this wasn't just any girl. She was known to have a ghostly presence, a haunting aura that made people shiver even from miles away. The townspeople dared not speak of her, for to speak of her was to invite her gaze, and no one who had felt it survived to tell the tale. It all started many years ago, when the town was just a sleepy little place. There was a girl named Clara, who was known for her beauty and kind heart. She lived with her father, a simple blacksmith, and they had a happy life. That is, until one fateful night when Clara disappeared. It was the kind of night when the wind howled like a beast, and the sky seemed to bleed red with the setting sun. Clara was last seen walking home from the forest, carrying a basket of wildflowers she had picked for her mother. She never made it home. Her father searched for days, weeks, calling her name into the wild forests, but there was no sign of her. The town rallied together, but nothing turned up. Until a year later, on a night just like the one when Clara had vanished. On that very night, the moon was at its brightest, and the town was restless. Some said they heard whispers in the woods. Some said they saw shadows moving. But one thing was certain. Clara was back, or rather something that looked like Clara. The girl appeared on the outskirts of town, her eyes hollow and her face pale, but her presence was magnetic, as though the moon itself had breathed life into her. She floated just above the ground, moving with an unnatural grace. The townspeople watched in fear, remembering the old stories, the ones about spirits that returned with unfinished business. But no one dared approach her. They knew better. But as time passed, strange things began to happen. Livestock were found dead in their pens, drained of life, as if the very life force had been sucked from them. Crops withered overnight, and the once joyful sounds of the town grew faint. It wasn't long before the disappearances began. People would venture out to see her, only to never return. Their bodies were never found, but the whispers grew louder, and the fear grew deeper. The mysterious girl was no longer just a story. She had become a living nightmare. One cold winter evening, A young man named Thomas, newly arrived in the town, heard the tales of the mysterious girl. Skeptical and brave, he laughed off the superstitions and decided to venture into the forest to uncover the truth for himself. He would be the one to expose the truth, they said. As night fell, he made his way into the woods, the branches scratching against his coat like long, bony fingers. He had a lantern in hand, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air grew colder, and he felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as though someone was watching him. He pushed the feeling aside, convincing himself it was just nerves. Hours passed, and the moon began to rise high above the trees. Thomas didn't know what to expect, but he continued forward, the wind now howling through the forest. Then, through the mist, he saw it. There, standing at the edge of a clearing, was a figure. A girl. Her face was turned toward him, her long dark hair swirling in the wind, her pale skin glowing in the moonlight. It was Clara, or at least someone who looked like her. He froze in place, but curiosity overcame him. He called out, "Clara, is that you?" The girl didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring at him with hollow eyes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Thomas took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to speak again when a strange, cold gust of wind blew past him, and the girl's eyes glowed an eerie shade of blue. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to distort. Time slowed, and Thomas felt as though the ground beneath him was sinking, warping, changing. He stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what was happening. The girl's gaze fixed on him, and his body went rigid. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. "You shouldn't have come," the girl whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. It was layered with 100 voices, all speaking at once. Some were young, some were old, some were broken and desperate. "Now you're part of the curse." Thomas felt a wave of panic rise in his chest as the air grew heavier, suffocating. His vision blurred, and in an instant, he was no longer in the forest. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold, dark, and vast. The ground beneath him felt like stone, and distant screams echoed in the distance. He looked around, his heart racing, and saw hundreds of faces staring at him, faces of people who had vanished, their eyes empty and lifeless. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" "This is where the lost souls are trapped," the girl's voice answered, now strangely soothing. "This is where they belong. This is where you belong." He turned around, and the girl was standing right in front of him, her cold hand reaching out toward him. Her touch was like ice, and as she made contact with his arm, he felt something inside him, something precious being ripped away. His very essence was being torn apart, piece by piece, and absorbed into her. "You will join us now," she said softly, her eyes gleaming. "You will live in the darkness with us forever." The world around him began to spin, and he tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body started to fade, his thoughts slipping away like sand in the wind. The last thing he saw was the girl's smile, a smile that wasn't just her own, but a smile of hundreds of souls all trapped within her. Days passed, and Thomas was never seen again. The townspeople thought he was just another victim of the curse, but they didn't dare search for him. The mysterious girl, now even more powerful, continued her haunting presence in the forest, waiting for the next victim foolish enough to uncover the truth. And every full moon, When the sky was bathed in silver light, the townspeople would hear whispers in the wind, the voices of the lost, trapped forever in the girl's curse, echoing through the trees. If you manage to sleep after this story, facing the next video might not be as easy. Do you dare to watch it? By the way, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.